Okay. You know, you can get rid of this floating meeting control thing. But if you do anything, like if you hit a button, oh, maybe not. It comes back randomly. It's weird. Anyway, doesn't matter. I'm thinking out loud. I got to stop doing that. It gets me in trouble all the time. Okay, we're in Acts 28. This is the last chapter of the book. You'll notice that the chapter starts in Malta in the midst of a shipwreck. And 30 verses later, the book ends. So he's not terribly interested in what happened in Rome. He seems to be wanting to make the point that he made it to Rome. So we got to look at that a little bit. Oh, anything's possible. And of course, all those speculations about what happened here at the end of this book. The world cannot fill all the PhD dissertations that have been written on what happened in the vacuum of knowledge that we have here, where we don't know anything that happened. That's the place where PhD dissertations get written, in the stuff you don't know, because nobody can prove anything. So we'll talk about that. Anyway, they're in Malta. They were in Malta, and they're making their way now. It's amazing how fast they get to Rome. So here's Malta right here. This little dot of land that God providentially guided the ship to, unbeknownst to anyone. Because when they shipwrecked, they didn't know that they were almost where they wanted to be anyway. Because they might have on purpose landed at Rhegium on the boot. So they may have just ended up just a little bit south. You know, because maybe God had a purpose for them staying at Malta, like the gospel going to non-Greek speaking Gentiles, pagan Gentiles. You know, you don't know. Luke doesn't record that. Luke never, these authors very rarely tell you why the events happened the way that they did. Sometimes they do. Matthew does a lot of this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. But they don't just interject and say, God told me this is why this happened, or this is why this happened, or I think this is why this happened. So you don't get an answer to the question why he got shipwrecked. And that's usually the case in biblical narrative. God keeps that knowledge to himself. The narrative is written in the indicative for you English teachers. The indicative case is the case of talking about, it's the case that I'm talking in right now. It's just what is the case, right? If I start talking about what ought to be, you all should go out and do this, and that's the imperative. I wish the world was this way. Man, might the politicians be more honest? That's the subjunctive. The narrative is indicative. It's just telling you what happened. You can't draw any conclusions necessarily about why the events happened, or what the author's motives were. It's very difficult to get that stuff. So you have to try to glean as conservatively as possible, glean from what is written. And we don't like that. We want answers. We want the why. Why was this way? And what was God doing? We want those kinds of answers. But as I've said before, if you're going to study the Bible, it's going to be very frustrating if you have questions that you want answers and you go to the Bible and you want an answer to your question, and it's not answering that question. That's very frustrating. You're going to try to wring out an answer to your question when the text was never meant to answer that question. So, fundamental rule of Bible study: go find out what questions the writer was trying to answer or did answer, and then ask those questions. Because then you're asking the right questions, because those are the ones that God answers. The right questions are the ones that God answers. The wrong questions are the ones that God does not answer. Sometimes he answers the question in a way that we don't like, so we do Herculean efforts to get out of the answer that was given. Like James chapter 2, so you see that Abraham was justified by works and not by faith alone. Ooh, that doesn't sound good. So we change it. Okay, there's a little lecture there that you've all heard before since 2006 for me, more than once. Now I just totally interrupted my stream of consciousness as I was once again thinking out loud. It's a very dangerous thing to do. So we're back at Malta, blah, blah. Great experience on Malta after the terrible shipwreck. experience across the ocean. Great experience on Malta. Luke has nothing but praise for the people on the island, even though they're pagans. No reported sharing of the gospel, no proclamation. Very strange. We wouldn't do that. We'd have Paul have
It says he healed them, but it doesn't say they turned to Christ.
No, and there's no proclamation. Right? There's just, they were there and these 2 or 3 things happened. Does that mean there was no proclamation that actually happened? Oh, I doubt it. But I do, what? Yeah, Paul is not going to, seriously, Paul is going to be silent on the question of the gospel with a bunch of pagans. Yeah. And then it generates, yeah. So we would love, like for my favorite question that doesn't get an answer is what happened to Julius, the Roman centurion that Luke speaks so highly of, and that had a high opinion of Paul. He just disappears from the narrative. He doesn't get saved in their narrative. He didn't, nothing. Had he become a Christian, I got to think like the jailer back in Philippi, Luke would have reported it. If there was a big response to the gospel presentation that Paul undoubtedly gave to these people, not necessarily, but undoubtedly. Why would Luke not have reported it? So Luke was there. Anyway, again, we're dealing with questions they don't answer, so we don't know. All right. At the end of 3 months, we set sail on an Alexandrian ship. What is important about an Alexandrian ship? It's from Egypt. There's one other detail about that. Wheat. It's one of those wheat. It's one of the grain ships that's traveling back and forth from Alexandria to what's so funny? You need to learn how to read my mind and get the one word I'm thinking of. But the ship wintered in, the ship is wintering in, there it is. The ship is wintering on the island of Malta. So there's already a ship there. What's that? Yeah. No, this other ship. This is at the end of 3 months, we set sail on, I should finish reading. We set sail on an Alexandria ship, which had wintered at the island, which had the twin brothers for its figurehead. So very specific description of it. After we put in at Syracuse, look how fast it happens. After we put in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days. That's in Sicily. And from there, we sailed around and arrived at Rhegium, Italy. And a day later, a south wind sprang up. And then the second day, we came to Puteoli. A great word, Puteoli. Puteoli. Go ahead and say it. Go ahead and say it and not laugh. See if you can. Smiling. Puteoli. All right. What?
Yeah.
Which comes from the same isthmus of land, peninsula of land. So they started in Malta, and within 11 to 15, let me finish it. Oh, there it is. Then we found some brethren in Puteoli, and we're invited to stay with them for 7 days, and thus we came to Rome. So in 11, 12, 13, 14, in 4 verses, they move from Malta shipwrecked at the beginning of the shipwreck. Then he records no, that's not right. At the end of the shipwreck. So after the 3 months, so from the end of the shipwreck to arriving in Rome is 4 verses. After he had just spent all that narrative on the shipwreck itself. Remember all that, everything from Caesarea all the way to Malta, the whole chapter 27. And then he finishes off from Malta to Rome in 4 verses. Paul? Yes. He's got a soldier with him.
The whole group is traveling.
Yes. Yes. And we're going to, I think there's a we. I think that's the end of the we's, the we section. Once they get to, thus we came to Rome. So Luke has traveled with Paul to Rome. Luke will be mentioned at the end of Colossians and Philemon as a fellow prisoner with Paul. So he stayed for some time with Paul in Rome because everybody figures that those 4 books, they're called the prison epistles. Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon are were all written from Rome at this time. So he's already spent 3 years in Ephesus. He's already written the book of Romans on his third journey. And now after this time, during this 2-year period, probably, he will write the books of Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. We'll probably talk about some of that when we do Romans. All right. So that's, let's see what I want to say. So that's why I highlighted it. There's some kind of crowning achievement in this statement right here, some kind of some kind of termination. Rome is the terminal point for the book of Acts. What started in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 1 with the ascension of Jesus and the statement in chapter, which we'll look at in a minute, chapter 1, verse 8, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. What started there with that statement terminates in Rome, which I didn't see coming. If you didn't read the narrative beforehand, would you think that the book was going to terminate in Rome? You don't really find out about that until 20 or 21, when Paul is in, I forget where he is, but on his way back from the third journey, he's told that he's going to visit Rome. He's going to visit Rome. But that's 20 chapters later. Gotta look at my notes. Okay. So they start the trip again in February, March, when the sea lanes open. This is interesting detail. The sailors are highly suspicious. Navy's, you're out at sea, you're at the mercy of the elements. This tends to be a superstitious lot back then, when you can't explain anything. Storms just come out of nowhere. We have radar on the ship now where you can actually see it and you can avoid it. So very rarely did my ship actually drive through. The only time you would drive through a storm during statement, because the memory is 33 years old, but the only time you would drive through a storm is when you're in the middle of a recovery where you have airplanes in the pattern and you can't just move well, even then you can do it. You could move the ship. I don't know. No, that didn't really happen. We got caught one time, ironically, off the coast of Florida, 250 miles off the coast of Florida. We never had anything that bad in the Med, which is really weird. I had that on video, the landing sequence during that storm. I had that on video and I lost it. That'd be interesting to watch. It's unbelievable. Talk about it some other time.
Storms worse in the Mediterranean than Florida?
No, but it's just, you had to, we got it here, not over there in this place. So it's got the twin brothers as the figureheads. That's the twin brothers, or I didn't know this. I looked it up. Castor and Pollux. It's 2 stars. Yeah, Gemini. That's exactly right. I'm a Gemini. Okay. Are you a Gemini? You are? Who's a Gemini? You are. When's your birthday? Oh, okay. I'm glad we established that.
Very important.
That's right. Changes everything. Everything in my life just changed. But anyway, Castor and Pollux, those names sounded familiar. I thought, where have I heard those names before? Did you see the movie Face Off? Nicolas Cage. Nicolas Cage played a character whose name was Castor Troy. He's the bad guy. His brother was named Pollux. Yeah. So they used the names from this. I mean, maybe they used it just because it's Gemini, but they could have also used it because they knew it was a story. There's 2 names in the Bible. I'm not recommending the movie. It's terrible. But they put John Travolta's face on Nicolas Cage and they put Nicolas Cage's face on John Travolta so that John Travolta, the FBI agent, can catch Nicolas Cage, the bad guy. Sorry. All right, the narrative picks up speed at this point. They arrive at Syracuse. Syracuse is here. Another interesting thing that I got to say. So when I joined the Navy, not when I joined the Navy, when I was going to join my ship, which was already on cruise in the Mediterranean, USS Forrestal, I'm flying over from Norfolk. So you take a military transport from Norfolk across the Atlantic Ocean to Sigonella, Sicily. my whole life since that time, I remember what I did for a living. Navigation in the air was fundamental to what I did for a living. And then we rented a car, me and the other ensign that was joining in another squadron. We rented a car and drove to Palermo, Sicily, which is the headquarters of the mob in Italy, or it used to be. Anyway, my entire life, since I did that trip, including when I was on the island of Sicily, I thought Sigonella was over here and Palermo was over here. Well, it turns out that Sigonella is here and Palermo's there. So we flew to the other side of the island and drove back west when I thought we flew to this side of the island and drove east. I looked at it like 2 or 3 times and I thought, that's not right. They got this wrong. I'm looking at this map. That's sick. Because I looked up Sigonella. Because I was curious. And that doesn't matter either. Okay, we don't need to look at images of that. It's fantastic ruins of days gone by. The glories of the Roman Empire in days gone by. From there, we sailed around and arrived at Rhegium. That's why I'm pronouncing it. And a day later, they're Puteoli. So here's the boot. They hit Italy. They're going to pick up another ship. Now the ships are everywhere, probably. So they have any problem getting ships. And you get that in the narrative. So they get to Rhegium, and they within a day, they're already in the major Alexandrian port, the major port where the Alexandrian grain ships land. To get the So yeah, even time wise, they cover 180 miles in a few days. I mean, after all that, after the 14 nightmarish days from Fair Havens to Malta. Yeah, they're back and forth all the time. I mean, Rome had at this point.
No, but I mean, at this moment where they're finally releasing to go there, how many people succeeded in bringing them?
I don't know. Right now it's March. Obviously, this grain ship felt it was safe enough at this point in the year finally to head out. I don't know. It's kind of weird. It must be this part of the journey that's so treacherous. Because once you get here, you can hug the coast to Rhegium, and then you can hug the coast all the way up. So it must be this treacherous little piece right here that they caused them to winter in Malta, the grain ship. It's too dangerous to even make this little crossing right here. 180 miles in less than 2 days. After 500 miles in 14 days between Fair Havens and Malta. All right. They don't have to wait for the disciples. This is fascinating. The word about Paul obviously has already reached them. He had written the book of Romans 3 years earlier or something like that. Never been there, never been to Rome. He writes this manifesto to all who are beloved of God in Rome, called as saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. He says to these Roman Gentiles. Now he's received as if he's a celebrity dignitary by his church that he's never. So in 1:8, do I have it open here? Here's his intro to Rome, to the book of Romans. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world. So of course it's Rome. So what happens in Rome makes its way around the empire. And the word about the church in Rome is the church in Rome is doing so well that the whole world hears about it, which that's what Paul's noted. But the point is that there's a very, very vibrant church, which we'll get back to in a minute, in the book of in Rome before Paul even gets there, which is a really ironic thing to happen. But we'll go back and visit that in a little bit. Centurion is gone. We're not going to hear about him anymore. The fact that these disciples, they get to this city, we found some brethren. So they're in the south, they're south of Italy, they're south of Rome still. Here's where they are. Here's Rome. They got a ways to go. But they found brothers here. So the gospel is not just in Rome, it's spread throughout the peninsula. That's the way it looks to me. And that seems to be Luke's point. Stayed with them for 7 days. So the Romans that he's with are allowing them to stay for 7 days. It's almost like a, what do you call it? Not a vacation, but a visitation time for Paul. The Romans have dropped out of the story. He's a prisoner, but they've dropped out of the story, and it's as if he's just continuing on his plan, like he always just had an itinerary to go to Rome, and he's going to stay where he wants to stay. They drop out of the story, and now he wants to stay in this city for 7 days to, like he did in Sidon. He stayed in Sidon with, was it Sidon where Philip was? And that doesn't sound right. Anyway, he stayed there for a few days on the way down to Jerusalem, and Rome is treated the same way. So who's really in charge here? Is it the Romans or is it God?
So he just brought a few soldiers along with him.
And then the soldiers are right there, there's been books written about the poor soldier that got chained to him. How would you like to be the pagan Roman soldier that gets chained to Paul every day for 8 hours? Because even if he's not going to talk to you, he's got people coming in and he's going to preach the gospel to. So you have to sit there and listen to it. So you might as well just give up and become a Christian, because it's going to happen. Then the great statement, thus we came to Rome. I think we underestimate the importance. That's the termination of the book, geographically. So you end up with this. Here's all of his missionary journeys plus Rome. That's Paul's travels during the book of Acts. Here's the first journey in Galatia, the blue line. Then there's the second journey where he bypasses Asia and hits Macedonia, Achaia, drops off Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus and heads back to Jerusalem, back up to Antioch, and then he comes right straight back to Ephesus, where he's going to spend 3 years on what we call the third journey, which was really just a 3-year stay in Ephesus. And then comes back, and now he's on to Rome. So Rome is not technically a missionary journey, but he is going to spend 2 weeks, as Luke says, preaching the gospel in Rome after the church has already been founded. These are not amateur believers here. He's not introducing them to anything. So we would love to have some of that interaction between lots of Romans, probably lots of slaves. The church is now largely Gentile because the Jews, we found out earlier, the Jews were expelled from Rome. That sounded worse than it really was. I was trying to talk while I was coughing. The Jews were expelled from Rome in 49 by Claudius, maybe because of the activity of Christians and the conflict with Jews. So Priscilla and Aquila end up in Corinth, but Nero rescinded, apparently, that edict, so the Jews were allowed back. Nero became emperor in 54. So the edict would have been in force for about 5 years, which clears Rome of Jews. So now you have a church that is exclusively Gentile, and it develops that way until the edict, for 5 years, until the edict is rescinded. But by the time the Jews come back, the Gentiles have the balance of power. So he's dealing with a largely Gentile church. And based on what happened in Rome, what we see in Romans, there was conflict. There may have been conflict between the Jews and Jews in the first century, in any circumstance you can imagine, would not have taken kindly to the idea that they're going to take a seat behind the Gentiles in any environment, let alone in a synagogue. So probably create a lot of problems. That's all discussion for Romans. All right, so let's deal with how do we want to do this? Okay, let's talk about Rome. I was thinking about this. So this is Romans, this is Acts 1:8, from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the ends of the earth. The story we actually got was Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and Rome. But it turns out the little secret that Luke was holding back the whole time, never mentioned, never even implied it, is that it appears that after Pentecost, the gospel had already made its way to Rome, so that when Paul gets there, there's a thriving church that's 25 years old. in Rome, more than that. Extraordinary story. I'm sorry. Yeah, about almost 30 years. It's ironic. I'm thinking through this right now. It's one of the oldest churches in the Roman Empire, if that's the case. Because they didn't start from Jerusalem, they didn't start sharing the gospel until they had to. But by then, the gospel had already made its way to Rome. So it turns out that the church in Rome is one of the most prolific and accomplished churches in the Christian world. It's other than Antioch, maybe. Got Antioch and Rome or something like that. Ephesus. But Ephesus didn't get evangelized until the second journey. Rome was already there as a church. Extraordinary. Or is it more like, I was thinking about this. So is the ends of the earth Rome? He just didn't say it that way. Well, Rome is not the ends of the earth. Rome is the center of the earth. So maybe it's an incomplete story. He just tells you the part till it gets to Rome. And now there's a sequel, and the sequel is not written. And the gospel, Luke, Acts ends on a very hopeful note. And you get the sense of the gospel continuing to propagate. And maybe he just leaves that open. There's that too. Yeah. Yeah. And maybe it's still not complete. I mean, it's never finished until he returns. It's just never finished. So I thought about it that way. And then I thought about it this way. Maybe it's this way, which is be closer to what I was just saying, what Dan was thinking is, I think. So maybe this is the book of Acts, and he cuts short, and this is just a prelude to the great proclamation proceeding now to the ends of the earth when it's universalized. The gospel, people from every nation under heaven are gonna be brought in to the kingdom. I tend to lean like this. It's an unfinished story, and it's deliberately so. The scope of Jesus' statement unto the ends of the earth was larger than the book of Acts.
Did the gospel go east at all? We don't hear about that.
No, we don't. And I think what we'll do is we're going to have a wrap up. Maybe we can get to it after this. I doubt it. But there's speculation. Did Paul get to Spain? Because at the end of the book of Romans, he says, I'd like to go to Rome to see you all and then be helped on my way by you to Spain, which is Latin territory, I think. And so he wants this ministry. He's fully evangelized Asia, these parts, and now he wants to move west in a new territory. And that's more like the ends of the earth. But that's no hint of that in Acts. In Acts, Luke never mentions Paul's plan to go to Rome at all, period. Until the very end of the book, I must see Rome also, but that's where it terminates. See, he never mentioned Spain. We'll get back to that without question. Okay, we do have to look at the Appian Way. Via Appia, huh? Then we got to do a search. It's always dangerous. Appian Way. Oh, I did a search for the satellite image too. I didn't learn anything. There it is, the Great Road. I think I have a picture of this. Sorry if you were looking at that. Appian Way. I gotta have something on the Appian Way. I don't know what I call it. Rome, Appian Way. I need some folders. I gotta divide these things up. So here it is. Here's Italy. So here's the Appian Way that they're gonna pick up, Puglioli, and up in Rome. But this, like I've said before, this road right here, it's an extraordinary road because it starts from like here in Bithynia and it proceeds all the way across to some port here, forget where you take a ship across and then it continues. So you can literally walk the same road, whatever this distance this is. It's a huge distance. I did it once to 1,500 miles or something like that across these provinces to get to Rome. So it really is true that all roads lead to Rome. They pick it up. It appears here now in the narrative. It's great. But there's the road. You can go visit it. You can walk the road that Paul without question walked. There's not a lot of roads we know that Paul walked or Jesus because they don't exist. You know, these were standard roads, like the road from Nazareth to Galilee would have been, Nazareth to Jerusalem would have been a standard road, you know, with a well-worn path, but we don't have that. We don't know what route he really took. We don't know what route he took to get to Golgotha. We don't know what roads Paul took across Asia and Macedonia and those places, but we do know that he traveled to Rome on the Appian Way. And so you could go walk this road between Puteoli and Rome, and you know you're walking the same path. Can trees be 2,000 years old?
Found it in like really harsh conditions, that can't be much ground.
Well, it wouldn't matter. I guess the rocks underneath their feet are 2,000 years old. There at that one spot. Extraordinary. You know, it's just they are, you can see it right here. Where they become unusable, the point is they're still active. They still use them and they only fix them when they have to. So here's another fixed one. Here's a really good picture of one that's been fixed. Look at that. And you got the ruins along the side because these inns would pop up along the road, you know, where people could stay for the night because you're going to walk and you can only walk so fast, especially on this, right? I mean, you know, a fast walk is 4 miles an hour. If you can walk 4 miles an hour for half an hour, it's pretty fast. But that's on nice pavement or whatever. On this kind of thing, you ain't walking 4 miles an hour, and you got everything you have on you. It's the Appian Way. It's really cool in my mind. Okay. The Appian Way, Via Appia. By Appia? Is that Italian? I mean, not Italian. Is that Latin for by? Via? I think so. All right. So the news of Paul's visit has preceded him. There's people there to meet him. So they already know he's coming. How did they know he was coming? I don't know, but they had a long time to learn. But how did the message get to Rome that Paul was on his way? Because he just came and got shipwrecked. So how did they get there? How did the word about him get there before he did? I don't really know. People went ahead. I mean, it's possible people went ahead. We don't have detail, but so they came out to meet. That's a long walk too. Think about that. I think I have that. Is that on this map? This is where they're guessing the 3 taverns, and the Appian Forum is right here. So they come from Rome down to there to meet him. Like I said, like he's some kind of distinguished visitor, which he was. I mean, I suppose if we got the book of Romans, just the people in this class, if one day we heard about this guy, we know about this guy, Paul, miracles and signs and wonders and so on, vision of Jesus and so on and so forth. And then you get this letter from him that's a manifesto and the greatest statement, the most refined statement. That's a daring thing to say, the most refined statement of the gospel in existence, which he could have sent to anyone. What would you think of it? You know, what would you do with that? Remembering that they preserved it and published it. So they knew what they had. That's the other side of inspiration, by the way. Yes, the letter can be inspired, but if the person that receives it doesn't care about it, then it gets buried in the sand. So there's this thing on the other side where the recipient of the thing knows what it is that he has in his hand and treats it as inspired, as sacred. And that's exactly what happened with books like Romans. Okay. He's never been to Italy, as far as we can tell. His only contact was the letter. That's 3 years in the past. It's about 33 miles from the market of Appius. I don't know whether these words are right. From here to here. So these guys walk 33 miles down the coast to meet Paul, probably with supplies, you know, and well, you'd like to have a video of that reception. Paul's got a Roman soldier with him, 4 soldiers chained to Paul. That's the way they did it. These people show, and he's just standing there. He's got all the power, but he's just a bystander, a chained, but he's chained. Who's chained? Is the soldier chained to Paul, or is Paul chained to the soldier? Because the soldier can't go anywhere either. He's got to stand there and take it.
Was it
You know?
tradition changed, or did it say that?
No, it's tradition. That's going to say that he's, does it say that he had a soldier, does it mention that he had a soldier chained to him earlier? That could be, maybe it's not chained, maybe but he can't go anywhere. He's got to stay right there. You know, he's a prisoner. But you got to wonder who's a prisoner of who at this point. But the point is that Roman authority has dropped off the map, and the sovereignty of God is now just taken over the narrative. As this great promise of God, by Jesus himself, standing by Paul in the vision, that he would see Rome. That was 20. So 8 chapters in the past, 1/4 of the book. As you have witnessed to me in Jerusalem, so you will also witness to me in Rome. That was the promise in either 20 or 21. And the narrative has relentlessly moved to fulfill that promise of Jesus for 7 or 8 chapters, for 1/4 of the book. And here we are finally. And this poor soldier is just there.
What was your birthday? He was allowed to stay by himself.
Yeah. I don't think they took that lightly. Everything I read is that, yeah, they don't take chances. Your prisoner escapes. Guess what happens if your prisoner escapes?
Live by yourself.
Not for long. Yeah.
I wonder if they have special-
The same thing with Jesus and the soldiers that guarded his tomb. There's portrayals of them in movies where they're asleep no. When they realized the tomb was empty, Matthew, they were so terrified. The soldiers went to the chief priests, and the chief priest said, look, tell everybody this. And if the governor asks anything, we'll keep you out of trouble. And the chief priest had these soldiers right where he wanted. They're going to say anything they wanted them to, because they were headed for the death sentence. It's Rome. Rome is a martial state. It's a military state through and through. Although ironically, the legions were not allowed in Rome. When we entered Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who was guarding him. Very favorable portrayal of the Romans again. He's very loosely controlled, which probably also means that nobody thinks this is going to stick. I don't have time for that. All right, now we get to it. So it's as if he's arrived in a new city for a new ministry, like when he got to Pisidian Antioch. That's just exactly like that. He got to Pisidian Antioch, he immediately went into the synagogue to try to persuade the Jews. Here, he can't go to the synagogue, so the synagogue has to come to him. But it's the same dynamic. He's going to go to the Jews first, and that's exactly what happens. After 3 days, Paul called, the very detailed eyewitness account, probably. Paul called together those who were the leading men of the Jews. Imagine that authority. How did that happen? These aren't the Christians. These are the Jews. He's not asking the church to do this. It's the synagogues that he's asking to do this. The Jewish leaders in Rome. When they came together, he began saying to them, brethren, calls them brethren, as a Jew, one from Jew to Jew, not from Christian to Christian. Though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. And when they had examined me, they were willing to release me because there was no ground for putting me to death. But when the Jews objected, I was forced to appeal to Caesar, not that I had any accusation against my nation. So stop right there for a minute. He does exactly what he did when he was before Agrippa. His first defense against Agrippa was, his chief defense before Agrippa was, I am innocent before both Roman law and Jewish law. I am a law-abiding Roman and I am a law-abiding Jew. There are no grounds for anything against me. That's exactly what he says here again, just like he said to Agrippa in 26, 2 chapters ago. And we're again, the favorability of the Romans, they were willing to release me from start to finish. It's the Roman world, the secular world, the Roman world finds no cause against Jesus or Paul. And he has to overcome the obstacle put before him, which is the rejection of his own people in the appeal to Caesar. So I got anything to say about that? So to the Jews first. So the disciples drop out of the narrative. There will be no proclamation in Rome. There was no proclamation in Malta. There was no proclamation on the ship on the way over. There's no proclamation in Malta, and there will be no proclamation in Rome. That's a strange way for the book of Romans, the book of Acts to end. A book based in the proclamation of the gospel and its advance. That's a strange way for it to end. We'll do some wrap up on that. Got to figure that out. All right. Paul's gospel message does not undermine Israel's traditions, it fulfills them. Let me get back to that. Verse 20. For this reason, therefore, I requested to see you and to speak with you, for I am wearing this chain. There it is. You can see him actually looking at it, and this poor soldier who's having to listen to all this superstitious nonsense. For the sake of what he calls the hope of Israel. In the Bible, in the New Testament, you see all these marvelous roundabout expressions to capture the full flora of God, what God is doing. Is that word, did I use that word right? What does flora mean? No, that's not the right word. I'm not going to try to get another one. But here it is again. It's called a periphrastic construction. So we have to go figure out. He assumed that they knew what he meant by the hope of Israel. But Luke doesn't tell us what he meant by the hope of Israel. So what is the hope of Israel? So here we have however many. Yeah, what is the hope of Israel? Let's get back to the essentials. How many say Messiah? I don't know that there's one right answer. I'll go with Messiah. Let's get a little closer. Resurrected Messiah. That's the part that they understand Messiah. They're totally on board with Messiah, the hope of Israel. It's the resurrected Messiah. Resurrected implies killed. And you're saying crucified. So crucified, then resurrected Messiah. That's the hope of Israel. And that's the proclamation in Acts. We'll look at that too. That's impossible. The very idea of a crucified Messiah is a contradiction in terms. For 10 reasons, not for one. I determined to know, this is 1 Corinthians, I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ. How did he say it? Jesus and him crucified. That's important enough to go look at for a second. Yeah, you look at this, you look at something like this. Now, what verse was that? 23. Jews ask for signs, Greeks search for wisdom. We preach the impossible. We preach the impossibility. We preach the nonsense that nobody can believe. Christ, the crucified Messiah. To Jews, a stumbling block, and to Gentiles, foolishness. But to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and wisdom. That's a fantastic summary summary statement of the stumbling block that is the gospel. In that time, what is the stumbling block of the gospel? It's right there in verse 23. They were preaching a crucified Christ. For I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I will not waver from the stumbling block. Why he was rejected. Why they were rejected. Preaching a crucified Christ. Crucified King. Okay. Hope of Israel. So hope of Israel. Let's go back and look at 26. This is Paul before Agrippa. You don't have to search too hard for this. Just go back and look at what happened previously. He's standing before Agrippa, King Agrippa. I am standing on trial for the hope of the promise made by God to our fathers, the promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain as they serve God day and night. And for this hope, I am being accused by the Jews. The hope being, I'm preaching a crucified Christ who was resurrected. And then he specifically mentioned resurrection. Then later on, by reason of his resurrection from the dead, he would be the first to proclaim light both to the Jewish people and to the Gentiles. The great promise to the fathers, the crucified, then resurrected Christ. Heart and soul of the gospel. Don't stop at Christ died on the cross for your sins. His vision, God's vision of redemption is full of grandeur.
So the crucifixion and the resurrection, putting this up beyond the Jews.
That's exactly right.
And that was unacceptable to the Jews because they were God's special people.
It's unacceptable, first of all, because they're preaching, we're talking about a crucified king, which is blasphemy to them. And then also, by virtue of the crucified Christ, by the virtue of the resurrected Messiah, he's a Messiah for all the nations, which means God shows no partiality. And even Peter had a terrible time with that. All of them did. So it's a stumbling block in every possible way. And they opposed him relentlessly to the death. Remember the plot of the 40. They would have happily gone to their deaths to stop Paul.
Mercy is hard to take.
The mercy of God, the idea that the mercy of God would extend to the nations, to the not disfavor of the Jews, but just to the, I don't know what you want to call it, impartiality, that was intolerable to them. They couldn't. Well, I mean, if you spent 1,400 years understanding your self-identity is as God's special people, and you viewed everybody else as contaminated, as unclean, as a contagion. I go back to that trip that Peter took to go up to Cornelius, the Roman centurion. Cornelius is an uncircumcised Gentile. He's as unclean as it gets. He sends down 3 other uncircumcised Gentiles to pick up Peter to hear a message from him. What did that walk look like? Peter's walking along with these 3 uncircumcised Gentiles. He's never done that before in his life, guaranteed. He stays as far away from these people as he can. Now he's been summoned to one of them, and that guy has sent 3 others to walk along with him for a day and a half. Did he walk on this side? Because the paths are only, I got a 5-foot span. You saw the roads. This is the path. Did he walk over here and they're walking over there? Did he walk behind them? Did he walk in front of them? I'll tell you what he didn't do. He didn't rub shoulders with them and talk about the weather next to each other. There's no way they did that. My hunch is the Romans, one of them was a slave, but 2 of them were slaves. One was a servant. One was a soldier. The 3 Romans, they're not necessarily Roman citizens, but the 3 Romans, they're walking in front, and all these circumcised Jews, because Peter had more than just him, there was more than just him. They're walking behind. And they're both, my hunch is they're both keeping to themselves. Because of this very thing. You just do not, if I don't associate with Gentiles, God doesn't bring the gospel to the Gentiles. If I don't associate with the Gentiles, God, there's no Messiah for the Gentiles. They come to us. The Messiah is for the Jews. And if the Gentiles want to come to us as Jews, as proselytes, so to speak, even then a second class, but as proselytes, then that's fine. But not like this. we're just one church. And everybody's the same, meaning, have the same status. That's how I understand it. And that's part of the great stumbling block. Yeah. Still missed it. That's the great chastisement. We'll close with that. I actually had visions again of finishing this today. I was going to finish Luke. I was going to finish the book today. How many times have I said that? Have you been counting? Remember the chastisement of Jesus on the road to Emmaus. Here's the important part. We just think it's a cute story about these two people, which we always assume to be men, on the road to Emmaus, leaving Jerusalem in dejection because they think that, as they say, we thought, we were hoping that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Well, they've given up on that hope. Why did they give up on that hope? Is it because they just didn't understand that Jesus had to die because he was going to die on the cross for our sins? Not exactly. He chastises them. Oh, foolish men and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. You don't even know your own scriptures. Why are we talking about this? You had it all right in front of you. Was it not necessary for the Christ to suffer these things? And to enter into his glory means to be resurrected from the dead. The same thing. Resurrected means vindicated, means exalted as king. Was it not necessary? Don't you understand that it had to be this way? It could be no other way the whole time. You just didn't understand. You were blind to your own. That's been his accusation the whole time, ever since the parable of the sower, which we'll talk about next week. Their blindness to their own, not just their blindness to him, their general spiritual blindness, their blindness to their own sacred word. They just would not understand it because they couldn't countenance what it had to say. That's how I read it. So the Jews will listen. Paul is going to say at the end of the book, one of the last statements. You won't listen. You won't listen, but they will. So I'll say a line that I was going to say for the end, but rejection by the Jews is the path by which salvation comes to the Gentiles. It's not Jews and Gentiles. It turns out that it's for the moment, Gentiles instead of Jews. By the virtue of the Jews rejecting the crucified Messiah, the gospel will now be offered to the Gentiles. And that's why it was to the Jew first. To the Jew first meant they get first pass, they're going to reject. And now, because of their rejection, God will now call a people to himself from among the Gentiles. And then eventually he's going to come back around because he never gives up on them. And he's going to bring them in too, but it's all right there. It's all in front of your face. It's have eyes to see it. Let's go ahead and stop. Okay. That's a great question. Just a minute. How do I get there? Okay. Bye-bye.